Chapter 5. So, at last, she was at her journey's end. Kristin Lavransdatter sat resting on a haycock by the wayside below Sionsborg. There was sunshine and a blowing wind. The part of the meadow that was not yet mown waved red and silky bright with seeding grass. Nowhere but in the Trondheim country were the meadows red like this. Below the slope she could see a glimpse of the fjord, dark blue and flecked with foam. Fresh white sea spray dashed up against the bluffs, as far as she could see along the strand below the forest-clad Byness. Kristin drew a deep breath. After all, it was good to be here again. Good, though it was strange as well to know that she should never go from here any more. The grey-clad sisters out at Rhine followed the same rule, St. Bernard's rule, as the brothers at Tautra. When she rose at cockcrow and went to the church, she would know that now Narkvi and Bjorgolf too were going to their places in the monks' choir. Thus, after all, she would come to live out her old age with certain of her sons, although not in the fashion she had thought. She drew off her shoes and stockings and washed her feet in the beck. She would walk into Nidaros barefoot. Behind her on the path up the castle hill, some boys were playing noisily. They were hard at work below the barbican, trying to find a way into the tumble-down work. When they grew aware of her, they fell to calling down foul words at her, laughing and hooting the while. She made as if she did not hear, till a little imp, 8 years old the boy might have been, came rolling down the steep grass and almost bumped into her, shrieking out some ugly words he had picked up in wantonness from the older boys. Kristin turned towards him and said, smiling, "No need to shriek so as to let me know you for a troll imp, for I see you have the rolling breeches on you." When the boys noticed that the woman answered, they came bounding down, the whole pack. But they fell silent and abashed when they saw it was an ageing woman in pilgrim's garb, and that she did not chide them for their bad words, but sat looking at them with great, clear, calm eyes, and a stealthy little smile on her lips. She had a lean, round face, with broad forehead and small, rounded chin. She was sunburnt and much wrinkled under the eyes, but after all she did not look so exceeding old. So the boldest of the boys took to talking and asking questions to hide the sheepishness of the troop. Kristin felt she could have laughed. These boys seemed so like her own rascals, the twins, when they were small, though she prayed to God that hers had never been so foul-mouthed. They seemed to be children of common folk in the town. And when the moment came that she had longed for all through her journey, when she stood below the cross on Fegginsbrekke and looked down on Nidaros, she was unable to collect her thoughts for prayer or meditation. All the bells of the town burst forth at that moment to ring to vespers, and the boys all talked together, wanting to point out all that was in front of her. Tautra she could not see, for a squall of wind with mist and scudding showers was sweeping over the fjord beneath Frosta. In the middle of the flock of boys she took the steep path that led down the Steinberg heights. And now cowbells clinked and herdsmen whooped around them. The cows were bound homewards from the town pastures. At the gate in the town wall across from Nidaride, Kristin and her young attendants had to wait while the cattle were driven through. Herdsmen hallooed, shouted and cursed. Oxen butted. Cows were crowded and crushed together, and the boys named the owners of this bull or that as they passed. And when they were through the port and were passing towards the town lanes, Kristin had more than enough to do to pick her way with her naked feet amid the cow dung on the poached-up track. Some of the boys followed her unbidden, even into Christ Church. And as she stood in the dim forest of pillars and gazed towards the lights and the gilding of the choir, the boys plucked ever at the stranger woman's gown, and tried to show her all such things as most draw children's eyes. From the patches of coloured sunlight falling through the rose window among the arches, and the tombstones on the floor, to the canopies of costly stuffs above the altars. Kristin was given no peace to collect her thoughts, but each word the boys said wakened the dull yearning in her heart. For her sons first and foremost, but for the manor too, the houses, the outhouses, the cattle, for the toil and the sway of motherhood. She was still reluctant to be known again of any who had been her friends or Erland's in days gone by. They were wont ever to be in their townhouses at festival time, and to have guests living with them. She shrank at the thought of meeting a company of them. Ulf Halderson she must seek out, for, as her bailiff, he had charge of the shares she still had in some farms north of the fells, and meant now to give in payment for her commons in the Rhine cloister. But it was probable he would have with him now his kinsfolk from the farm at Scown, so she must wait. But she had heard that a man who had served among Erland's men-at-arms in the days he was warden had his dwelling in a small yard out on Bratteren. He worked with the dolphin and porpoise fishers on the fjord, and kept a lodging for seafarers. When she came there, she was told that all the houses were overfull already. But then came the man himself, Amund, and knew her straight away. Strange it was to hear him cry out her old name. "Now, I know. Is it not Erland Nicolasen, Lady of Huseby? All hail, Kristin! How can it be you are come hither to my house?" He was full glad that she would be content with such shelter as he could give her for the night, and he promised he would sail her out to Tatra himself the day after the festival. Till far on in the night she sat out in the courtyard talking with their one-time housecarl, and it moved her deeply when she noticed that they that had been Erland's men still loved their young chieftain's memory and held it in high honour. Again and again Amund spoke of him as young. From Ulf Halderson they knew of his hapless death, and Amund said never did he meet any of his old fellows of Huseby days, but they drank to the memory of their gallant master. And twice some of them had put their money together and had masses said for him on his death day. Amund asked much after Erland's sons, and Kristin too asked of old acquaintance. It was midnight before she got to bed by the side of Amund's wife. Nothing would serve him at first but that they should both give up their bed to her, and at last she was happy to accept with thanks of his proffer that at least she should take his place. The next day was Olaf's wake. From early morning Kristin walked about the shore by the river mouth, looking at the bustle on the wharves. Her heart beat faster when she saw the Lord Abbot of Tatra step ashore, but the monks who were with him were all elder men. Long before mid-afternoon, folk were streaming towards Christ Church, bearing or holding up their sick and cripples, so that they might come near the shrine when it was borne out in procession the next day after High Mass. As Kristin came up through the booths set up by the fence round the churchyard, they sold for the most part meat and drink, wax candles, and mats woven of rush or birk twigs to lay beneath one on the church floor. She stumbled upon the folk from Anderbu, and Kristin took the child while the young wife got herself a draught of ale. At that moment came the procession of English pilgrims with songs and banners and lighted tapers. In the press and crush, as they made their way through the throng of folk by the booths, she lost the Anderbu folk and could not find them again. For a long time she wandered hither and thither on the outskirts of the crowd, lulling the shrieking child. When she laid its face against her neck and would have comforted it with caresses, it mouthed about and sucked at her skin. She saw that it was thirsty, and she did not know what to do. It seemed vain to seek for the mother. She must go down into the streets and ask where she could get it milk. But when she came out onto Upper Lungstrait and would have gone northward, there was again a great press of folk. From the south came a train of knights, and at the same time the men-at-arms from the palace marched into the space between the church and the crossed friar's house. Kristin was thrust aside into the nearest lane, but here too folk were hurrying to the church on horse and on foot, and the press grew so great that at length she had to take refuge up on a stone dyke. The air above her was full of the noise of bells, the cathedral chimes ringing out Nona Hora. The child stopped shrieking at the sound. It looked up at the sky, and a gleam of understanding showed in its dull eyes. It smiled a little. Touched with pity, the mother of other children bent and kissed the poor little creature. Then she saw that she was sitting on the stone wall around the garden of the Nicolaus house, their old town mansion. Well should she know the stone-built chimney rising through the turf roof, the back of their hall house. Close by her stood the houses of the Spittal, whose right to share the garden with them had roused Erland's wrath. She pressed the stranger woman's child to her breast, kissed it and kissed it. Then someone touched her knee, a monk in the white gown and black cowl of the preaching brothers. She looked down into a pale yellow, furrowed old man's face, a long, narrow, infallen mouth, two deeply sunken amber eyes. "Can it be? Is it you, yourself, Kristin Lavransdatter?" The monk laid his crossed arms upon the dyke and buried his face in them. "Are you here?" "Gunnulf!" At that he moved his head so that it touched her knee where she sat. "Do you think it is so strange that I am here?" Then she called to mind that she was sitting on the garden wall of this house that had been his first and her own afterwards, and thought, yes, it was strange indeed. "But what child is this you have on your knee? Sure, this cannot be Gart's son." "No." At the thought of little Erland's healthy, sweet face and strong, well-made body, she pressed the poor little stranger child to her, overcome with pity. "It is the child of a woman that crossed the fells along with me." But then there dawned upon her what Andres Simonson had seen in his childish wisdom. Filled with reverence, she gazed on the pitiful creature that lay upon her lap. But now it wept again, and before anything else she had to ask the monk if he could tell her where she could get milk for the child. Gunnulf led her eastward round the church to the house of the preaching friars, and got her a bowl of milk. While Kristin was feeding her foster child, they talked together, but their talk went but haltingly. "So long a time has gone by, and so much has happened since last we met," she said sorrowfully. "And it must have been heavy for you to bear the tidings of your brother." "God be merciful to his poor soul," whispered Brother Gunnulf in a shaken voice. Only when she asked about her sons at Tautra did Gunnulf speak something more freely. With great gladness had the convent welcomed these two novices, come of the best kindred in the land. Nicolaus seemed to have such excellent gifts of mind and made such strides in learning and godliness that the abbot must needs call to mind his noble forefather, the church's well-gifted champion, Bishop Nicolaus Arneson. That was in the first days. But a while after the brothers had taken the cowl, Nicolaus had misbehaved badly and had wrought much trouble in the cloister. Gunnulf did not know the causes of the trouble fully, One was that Abbot Johannes would not suffer that young brothers should be ordained priests before they were full 30 years old, and he would not depart from this rule for Nicolaus's benefit. And as the Reverend Father thought that Nicolaus read and pondered more than was good for him, and that he was breaking down his health with pious exercises, he thought fit to send him to one of the cloister's cattle farms on Indero, to work there under some of the elder monks at the planting of an apple orchard. Then, it was said, Nicolaus had broken out into flat disobedience to the abbot's behests, had charged his brethren with having wasted the cloister's goods in high living, with sluggishness in the worship of God, and with looseness in their talk. The matter, said Gunnulf, was kept for the most part within the convent walls, as was but reason. But it was said, too, that he had defied the brother whom the abbot appointed to chasten him. For some time he had lain in a penitentiary cell, Gunnulf knew, but since then he had humbled himself, when the abbot threatened to part him from brother Bjorgulf, and to send one of them to Munkebo. 'Twas like it had been the blind brother that egged him on. But on this threat Nicolaus had grown meek and contrite. "'Tis their father's nature that is in them," said Gunnulf bitterly. "No one could see that my brother's sons should find it easy to learn obedience, or that they should show steadfastness in the godly life." "Just as likely to be a heritage from their mother," answered Kristin sorrowfully. "Disobedience was the chief of my sins, Gunnulf, and I too was unsteadfast. All the days of my life have I longed both to go the right way and to follow my own wildered paths as well." "Erlen's wildered paths, don't you mean?" said the monk darkly. "'Twas not only once that my brother lured you astray, Kristin. I think he lured you astray every day you lived with him. Such forgetfulness he wrought in you that you did not remember when you had thoughts that you blushed at, that you could not hide the thoughts of your heart from an all-knowing God." Kristin gazed before her. "Now, I don't know, Gunnulf, that you are right in this. I don't think I have forgotten at any time that God saw into my heart. All the greater, perhaps, is my sin. And moreover, 'tis not so, as you think, that I need blush for my immodest wantonness or my weakness. Rather must I feel shame that my thoughts of my husband were many times more bitter than the poison of serpents. But perhaps it must needs have come to this. It was you who once said to me that they who have loved one another with the fiercest desire come in the end to be as two vipers biting each other's tails. But it has been my comfort in these years, Gunnulf, as often as I thought how it was Erlen's lot to go before God's judgment seat, unhouselled and unholpen, struck down with wrath in his heart and blood on his hands, that he did not grow to be what you said and what I became. He bore in mind anger and wrong done him as little as he bore anything else in mind. Gunnulf, he was so fair and he looked so peaceful when I laid his body out. I think that the all-knowing God knows that Erlen never bore a grudge to any man for any cause." The brother gazed at her with wide-opened eyes. Then he nodded. After a while the monk asked, "Did you know that Eilif Sirksen is priest and counsellor to the nuns out at Rhine?" "No," said Kristin, beaming with gladness. "I thought it was therefore you had chosen to go there," said Gunnulf. Soon after he said that he must go back to his cloister. The first nocturne was begun already when Kristin came into the church. In the nave and about all the altars there was a throng of folk, but one of the vergers, who saw that she bore a most sickly child in her arms, pushed her forward through the press till she came right in front among the many cripples and sick folk in sorest need, who were gathered in the middle of the church under the great dome, and in full view of the choir. Many hundred lights burned in the church. The church servants took the pilgrims' tapers and fixed them upon the little hillock-shaped towers studded with spikes that were set up all down the nave and aisles. As the light of day died out behind the many-coloured panes of glass, the church grew warm with the smell of the burning wax, and ere long it was filled too with the sour stench from the rags of the sick folk and the poor. When the song of the choir soared under the vaulting, and the organ pealed, and the noise of flutes, drums and stringed instruments resounded, Kristin understood why it might be that the church was called a ship. In the mighty house of stone, all these folk seemed to be on board a vessel, and the singing was like the noise of the sea whereon it was upborne. Ever and anon it came to rest, as when the billows are stilled, and a single man's voice bore the lesson out over the listening throng. The close-packed faces grew paler and more weary as the wake night wore on. Scarce anyone went out between the services, not at least of those who had places in the middle of the church. Between the nocturnes they dozed or prayed. The child slept well nigh the whole night. Once or twice Kristin had to lull it a little, or give it milk from a wooden flask that Gunnulf had gotten for her from the cloister. The meeting with Erlend's brother had stirred her strangely, the more so that every step of the road hither had brought her nearer and nearer home to the memory of the dead man. She had thought little on him in these last years, while her work for her growing sons gave her little time for memory of her own fate. Nonetheless, the thought of him had been as ever, as it were, close behind her, only that she had not had the time to turn towards it. Now she seemed to see her soul as it had been in these years. It had lived as folk live on a manor through the busy summer half-year, when they move out of the great hall and stay in the storehouse loft. All day long they go to and fro past the winter hall, never thinking of going in there, though they have but to lay their hand on a latch and push open a door. And when at last some day they have an errand thither, the house has grown strange and almost solemn because of the air of loneliness and quiet that has come to it. But while she was speaking with Gunnulf, who was the last living witness of the interplay between seed time and harvest in her life with the dead man, it seemed to her that she had come to look out over her life in a new way, as when a man comes up on a height above his native place, where he has never climbed before, and looks down from it into his own dale. He knows each farm and fence, each thicket, the gully of each beck. But he seems to see for the first time how these things all lie on the face of the land. And seeing things in this new way, she had found all at once words that swept away both her bitterness against Erlend and her terrors for his soul, borne off by sudden death. Ill will he had never borne to anyone. She saw it now, and God had seen it always. So at last she was come so far that she thought she could look on her own life as from the uppermost step of a glen. Now did her road lead down into the darkling valley. But before she took that road, she had been given grace to understand that, in the loneliness of the cloister and at the gates of death, there waited for her one who had ever beheld the life of mankind as men's parishes look seen from the mountain brow. He had seen the sin and the sorrow, the love and hate in the hearts of men, as one sees the rich manors and the humble cots, the teeming cornfields and the abandoned wastes, all born on the bosom of the same countryside. And he had descended. His feet had trodden the peopled lands and stood in palaces and huts. He had gathered up the sorrows and the sins of rich and poor and lifted them aloft with him upon a cross. Not my happiness and my pride, but my sin and my sorrow, oh, my sweet Lord." She looked up where the crucifix stood, uplifted high over the triumphal arch, while the morning sun lit up the high-set coloured panes deep among the pillars of the choir, and a glory as of red and brown and green and blue gems dimmed the light from the tapers on the altar and from the golden shrine behind. Kristin listened to the last vigil, the matins. She knew that the lessons in this service told of God's healing miracles through the power vouchsafed to his faithful knight, King Olaf Haraldsson. She lifted the sick stranger child up towards the choir and prayed for it. But she was so icy chill from her long vigil in the cold of the church that her teeth chattered, and she felt faint from fasting. The smell of the many folk, and the sickening fumes of the sick and the beggars, mingled with the smoke of the wax candles, and sank down in a heavy, strangely greasy and clammy cloud upon the people kneeling on the stone floor, cold in the cold morning. But a fat, kind, cheerful countrywoman who had sat dozing a little against the foot of the pillar just behind them, with a bearskin underneath her and another over her lame legs, awoke now and drew Kristin's weary head down upon her wide lap. "Rest a little now, sister. You have need of it, I think." Kristin slept in the strange woman's lap and dreamed. She stepped over the threshold of the old hearthroom house at home. She was young and unwed, for she saw her own uncovered thick brown plaits hanging forward over her shoulders. She was in company with Erland, for he was even now drawing himself upright after going through the doorway before her. By the hearth her father was sitting, binding arrowheads on the shafts. He had his lap full of bunches of sinew string, and on either side of him on the bench lay piles of arrowheads and sharpened shafts. Just as they stepped in, he bent forward over the heap of embers and made to take up the little three-legged metal cup that he always used to melt resin in. But swiftly he caught back his hand, shook it in the air, and then he stuck his burnt fingertips into his mouth and sucked them, while he turned his head towards her and Erland, and looked up at them with a wrinkled brow and a smile on his lips. Then she awoke, her face wet with tears. She kneeled through the high mass when the Archbishop himself served the holy rite before the high altar. The clouds of incense rolled through the echoing church, where many-coloured sunlight was mingled now with the wax tapers shining. The fresh, spicy scent of the frankincense spread abroad and overcame the smell of poverty and sickness. With a heart that seemed bursting with ruth for the flock of the infirm and the needy in whose midst God had set her, she prayed in a rush of sisterly tenderness for all who were poor as she, and who suffered as she herself had suffered. "I will arise and go to my father,"